This is Common Sense Radio. Straightforward and no excuses.
All right. Come on now.
This is the Steve Gruber Show.
Call me crazy.
Oh, yeah.
What I said was perfectly right and spot on accurate.
Boy's got a mouth like a cannon, always shooting it all.
Stop.
Got it.
Yeah, stop. I mean, you're way off script.
Got it in me. Gonna quit until it all comes out.
Hey, boy!
Been a long education.
Yeah, you know, it's not cynical. It's common
But
sense.
my homework is
Pay attention to me when I'm talking to you.
I'm gonna rock the nation. Rock the nation.
Genuine, accountable, and raw. Here is Steve Gruber.
It is Thursday, my friends, and welcome to it. It's the Steve Gruber Show. This hour brought to you in part by Mesa. Good health, good business, and great schools. So, I was reading yesterday, as I pretty much spend most of my days, in large part reading, studying, finding out what other people think and say and do. And I came across this article about Tim Cook. Tim Cook is the chief executive of technology giant Apple, if you don't know. He's the guy that took over for Steve Jobs. Tim Cook, the chief executive of Apple. He forecasted the death of cash by the time current university students have a family. Now, you know, the forecast of the death of cash is really not that unique. And it reminded me of an article that I wrote based on the things that are going on today that I wanted to revisit. An article I wrote, not that long ago. Last year, I guess. Things that'll be gone in 50 years or less. The right to keep and bear arms will be one of the first things to vanish on the way to 2065. Gun ownership, is such a quaint idea and such a focus on the now power-thirsty progressive movement. Make no mistake, the incremental destruction of the Second Amendment is about to commence. The left has never lost its focus of eliminating the private ownership of firearms altogether. And with Barack Obama picking up speed on his radical transformation of America, I believe it will begin before he leaves office in January of 2017. That is, if he does in fact leave. Right now, I'm pretty sure he could get the Supreme Court to discard the 22nd Amendment and create some new interpretation of what it really is supposed to mean. Don't laugh. These things I'm beginning to lay out are far more likely than you would care to admit. By the time my youngest son is my age, I seriously doubt the Second Amendment will be intact. In fact, I believe in 50 years' time there will be almost no private ownership of weapons anywhere in America, and not just guns, but most types of archery equipment, knives of certain sizes and lengths, and anything else that might cause bodily harm. Possession of certain classes of these weapons will be punishable by very swift and severe zero-tolerance laws, putting the guilty in prison for long terms, maybe as long as life for some firearms. The freedom of speech in 2065 will be very different than it is today. By that time, many mainstream religions will have been removed from nonprofit status, run into oblivion by an endless barrage of attacks from the left. Churches, in many respects, will be treated like modern-day hate groups and pariahs. The way gays and lesbians used to flock to secret weekend retreats and holidays to be among their own is the only way some of these churches will even survive. The American flag will still exist, but it will be removed from primary and secondary schools and most government buildings because it offends too many people for its representation of racism, sexism, and imperialism. School kids will have no idea in 50 years how to recite the Pledge of Allegiance because they will have never have heard it. Most will have never heard the Lord's Prayer either. ATMs will disappear long before we reach the 50-year mark. After all, the cash will be eliminated much sooner. The financial collapse of Greece, followed by other European Union nations, will usher in the end of the EU, the euro, and in just a few short years, cash in nearly all nations, including the United States, will be gone. The reasons given for this drastic move will be many. The party leaders will invoke fear of crime, illegal drugs, plus protecting the young and elderly from being betrayed and being preyed on by crooked bankers and filthy criminals. A vibrant black market will spring up in the shadows, but getting caught could mean the loss of your home, your job, and likely even your freedom. The government will frown heavily on anyone operating outside of this because it will be outside the normal boundaries of society. Freedom of speech and of the press will be legal, but not in the ways you think of them today. Publishing anything considered derogatory about someone else's chosen personal identity will be punishable by prison time. Discussions of America and its founding fathers will be frowned upon and will not be taught in any public school. Those white men, our children, will be taught, exploited others solely for their own personal gain. They will learn little more on this subject. The days of jumping into the car and running to the grocery store will be a thing of the past as well. Personal transportation was a luxurious extravagance that simply had to be eliminated. The party able to create the new electric trolley cars to make sure people could get to work or the market, but that was more than enough. The planet, of course, was being destroyed by this ridiculous endeavor of driving oneself around. It, we were told, created the global warming crisis. Though in 50 years' time, the notion of global warming will also be debunked thoroughly as well. The good news is, in the next 50 years, we will have stopped using petroleum-based products altogether, though. More accurately, they won't be widely available to the general public, but those higher up in the party will still be able to get many of these things that they need, like plastics and cosmetics and such. And, of course, petroleum will certainly be available for the machines of war. Private property rights will be one of the things that comes later on this list, but make no mistake, the idea of owning your own home or farm or cottage on the lake will be no more in 50 years. The government will know far better who needs housing and who doesn't, and where those houses should be. The government will be best suited to determine where you should raise your kids, what schools they should attend, and later be able to help your kids pick their career path that best suits their individual talents. The idea that you would have your own home or decide which neighborhood to live in without considering all the implications doesn't even make sense, now does it? Cigarettes will actually be gone by then. Smoking tobacco so totally frowned upon that only outcasts would even consider it. The penalties for smoking tobacco will be substantial and severe. However, the use of marijuana will be widespread, accepted, and, in fact, encouraged. Beef, well, it won't be around. Meat for your consumption will be nearly gone in 50 years. The farms will be driven out of business by ever more and stricter regulations and lawsuits over water and air quality and the alleged link to the now defunct global climate change theories. Farms will also be peppered with lawsuits from animal rights groups. The party bosses will still, of course, have steak on their plates, but yours will likely be no more than once a week and then only maybe 3 or 4 ounces. The backyard chickens you won't have in 2065. You see, the government will make sure to keep everyone safe by stopping the unregulated hobby farms. All it's going to take is getting some sick kids and blaming some poor local schmuck and putting it on TV and then saying that's his fault. We need to regulate this. Say goodbye to your dog as well. Keeping pets will be frowned upon. You can't go fishing because, well, you're using fossil fuels and those aren't available anymore. And why the hell would you be out catching fish anyway? There's more important things to do. And think about the damage you're doing to the planet. Electricity won't be gone, but it'll certainly be rationed. That'll start next year. Unfortunately, the green movement will still have a lot of work to do to deliver all the juice Americans and others actually need. The amount of electricity you will get will be based on your need and your value, your contribution to the community as well. This is just the beginning of the list of all that could vanish in the next 50 years. These things are going to disappear because liberty and freedom are evaporating now, leaving the rest no choice but to disappear as well, unless you, the individual, say enough. Stand up, America. It's the Steve Gruber Show.
Delivering Michigan common sense with a big dose of truth and honesty.
I've been waiting for years to buy a brand new Cadillac.
And did I mention when I think that private transportation will be gone in 50 years because you'll have no need for it, and it's an extravagance that the government will get rid of. And some of the other things that they'll say about getting rid of your private car. Google and some of these other companies will have a car that can drive you around potentially, so maybe it won't be public transportation. But, they'll end car accidents. Drunk driving won't exist. Kids won't be able to drive away with a car. You won't be able to steal a car. I mean, all the advantages of you forfeiting your freedom to drive a car, they'll give you a whole list of things of why it's a good idea. And again, lowering crime and less gas. Of course, you'll only be allowed to drive when the chip in your car says you have allotted miles. Otherwise, it'll sit in your driveway because, who are you to use resources from this planet to frivolously go for a drive? It's the Steve Gruber Show on a Thursday. My next guest, Renn, City Journal contributing editor and a Manhattan Institute senior fellow. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
And speaking of cars, which I've been doing for the last few minutes, in Michigan, we just passed a whole pile of bills, $1.2 billion. It'll raise our gas tax by 7.3 cents. I guess that's January of 2017. But as you point out, alternative transportation projects like bike lanes and so forth often rely on federal highway funding. So putting bike and rail advocates are now they're in a tougher spot every day. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. The gas tax at the federal level has kind of been eroding thanks to inflation because it hasn't been raised since the early 90s. And that's the money that the people who profess to hate cars and claim everybody needs to be in the transit and bicycle and walking business, they rely on gas taxes largely to fund their projects. And therefore, they have kind of become the defenders of a system at the federal level that produces the opposite results that they say they want.
All right. So how can they have it both ways? I mean, I know they're liberals and that they wanted to have it both ways, and common sense and logic have little place in this conversation. But seriously, how can you have it both ways?
Well, not everybody in the world funds their transportation system with gas taxes. A lot of countries have very high gas taxes, but that money goes into the general fund, and then they fund transportation in other ways. And I think in general, as we get with electric cars, more fuel-efficient cars, driverless cars, this idea of paying for infrastructure through the gas tax is probably going to become increasingly untenable over time. You already have states like Oregon looking at mileage taxes and other ways. So I think in general, we're going to have to look at different ways of financing transportation in general. But what I would say is what a lot of people on the right have supported is this concept of devolution, which is instead of this big federal program, let's give transportation back to the states, get rid of all or most of the federal gas tax, and then let states like Michigan put that back in to do whatever they want if they want. That lets states like New York, here in New York City where I'm based, we need public transit. We need a lot more money for public transit. In a place like Michigan, you need more roads. So why do we need this one-size-fits-all federal system? I'm not really sure, but that's something that I think these advocates are going to need to be looking at.
Aaron, have you been drinking this morning?
No.
Because what you proposed is perfectly clear-minded and makes perfect sense, which means that there's no chance on God's green earth it'll ever happen.
Maybe I have a hangover or something.
Well, it could be, because, the idea of the federal government giving up all that money and letting the states decide will never happen. Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. I doubt that it would ever happen. It's the right thing to do. You're on the right track. And maybe, just maybe, there'd be a glimmer of hope if we had a Republican president to make such a thing happen that believed in states' rights. Because what you just said is exactly right. The federal government, we can fix our own roads if we get to keep our own money, and so can everybody else.
Right. Well, I think that's the irony I pointed out in this piece I did for City Journal. It's the people who profess to be interested in bicycling who are the biggest supporters of a federal system that puts 80% of the money on roads nationally. And what they're afraid that in a lot of these states, let's just take Kansas, for example. It's kind of got a very conservative government. Kansas isn't going to give any money to bicycles, let's just say. And the advocates fear that. And so they want to force Kansas to give a certain amount of money to bicycles, basically. And at the price of doing that is most of the money goes to roads in places like Oregon or New York or California or places that may want to do different things to it. So I say let Oregon and Colorado and these places that want to go do what they want to do, let them do it. Give them their own money and let them go do it. And then places like Kansas or Indiana that want to be more road-oriented, let them do that, and then the market will decide.
Two things. If Kansas doesn't want bike paths, it's because they're all racist. That'd be the liberal sort of point of view. Just throw something completely nonsensical, a complete non sequitur in there, and just throw it at them and make them feel guilty. Number two.
In fairness, I never heard anyone say that you're racist. I think it really comes from this concept of environmental consciousness.
I was being sarcastic. My point being
it's much more related to climate change and other types of rhetoric around that. In fact, in a lot of places like Portland, Bike lanes have been opposed by the black community because they're seen as a tool of gentrification, catering to white hipsters. These young millennials with their beards.
See, it is racist.
And so there have been racial tensions over these bike lanes in a number of places, but in the other direction.
See, I said it to be completely absurd, and yet somewhere out there, bike lanes are racist to some idiot because that's where we get in this world. If you can't have a credible argument, no matter what the conversation, throw racism on there. That's the one card that beats all. Good Lord, Aaron, I'm going to have a headache after this. And today would be a beautiful day in Michigan to ride your bike. It's 50 degrees with 65-mile-an-hour wind gusts. I mean, that'd be awesome, getting flattened on your bike on your way to work. I'll give you 20 seconds for the last word.
Well, that's what a lot of people don't know. In a lot of European countries, they have much more temperate climates and much lower humidity, much better for bicycling year-round. I'm a cycling advocate, though.
So am I. I like bicycles. Anyhow, Aaron Renn, thank you so much from City Journal. Thank you so much. Bike lanes are racist. Well, of course they are. Everything's racist. It's the American way.
Taking a closer look at the stories that affect you most with a big dose of common sense. Alrighty, it's Thursday. Welcome to it. It's Thursday on the Steve Gruber Show. And my next guest, I read on a regular basis. He's got some great ideas. Sometimes he's wildly wrong, but I accept that. And I read him anyway. And I guess that's the point. You don't agree with people all the time. But Ken Braun is a writer for M Live here. So he's, you see his stuff all over the state at different times. A political columnist. Ken, welcome to the program again.
Thank you, Steve. If we agreed with each other all the time, one of us wouldn't be necessary.
Well, that would be my point. Anyhow, no, you write a lot of, I think, provocative things oftentimes, and sometimes I agree with you, and sometimes, well, I don't. But on this particular topic today, we're talking about a taxpayer bill of rights, and I think that's not a bad idea. And one of the things you talk about, in fact, coming up later on the program here, we're going to have State Senator Rick Jones talking about marijuana growing facilities where it would be managed by the state, and therefore you'd have a taxation at the grow, at the distribution, and at the sales level of that whole process. And so you talk about Colorado doing that, but it's not that far away in Michigan. But then you go into the whole taxpayer bill of rights. Ken, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's what the taxpayer bill of rights is. Colorado is really the only state that's got it to that level. It's very simply, it's a cap on the growth of government that cannot exceed per capita inflation. So the growth of people and prices, government can get as big as the number of people you have and the amount of inflation you have. It's not a hard cap. If the lawmakers decide, oh my gosh, we've got an emergency or we want to invest in something, they can go to the people and say, hey, we want to take in a little bit more money, which is what they did in Colorado with their marijuana tax. They said, we've got this new revenue stream. We'd like to have the authorization to go above our Tabor cap with this new revenue stream, and the people gave them the authority to do it. But otherwise, it's a speed limit on government that's pretty much the most effective in the nation, and it's kept the growth of government in Colorado in check. And I might add, Colorado's a state that has higher than average per capita income. It's a growing state. It's everything Michigan has wanted to be for the last for the kind of the lost decade we had.
Sure. As I look at Michigan, though, the biggest challenge, and this is not unique onto Michigan, Ken, but we have something in the neighborhood, and it depends on who you ask because it's hard to get an accurate or honest answer. But how much debt do we owe as a state? And it's somewhere between about $90 and $150 billion. So our annual, what was our budget this year? $54.5 billion. So it's somewhere between 2 and 3 times our annual budget here in the state. We've got to get rid of this debt somehow. And it's not just Michigan. Every state has to do this. Towns, communities, counties. And as I look at the Bill of Rights, I agree with that because we want to keep the growth of government down. But how do we also at the same time address this staggering debt that we've built all over this nation?
Well, debt service is part of that budget, just as debt, paying off your mortgage or your car payment is part of your household budget. And and Colorado has debts as well. As you said, every state has them. There's reasons to have good debt. If you bond for something that you want to use over 30 years, then you might want to pay for it over 30 years as well. So the size of the debt, I would look at things that within the components of it, and is there good spending? Is there bad spending? What is the use of that debt? And the TABOR would allow, you could also ask the voters, we'd like to borrow $20 billion to build roads over the next 20 years. Can we do that, voters? So that's one of the things that would be allowable under this. But again, it would be subject to whether the people said yes or no.
See, now that part I like. I like the input of we would borrow money to build roads. Speaking of which, real quick, what is your take on this new package that was signed into law here a couple of days ago?
I'm one of those people that would have loved to have funded the roads completely with cuts in other places in government.
Me too.
I'm not a majority, though, and the fact is we do need the roads, and there are people that wanted to do it all with tax increases. So it strikes me as, in a representative government, a pretty good meet everybody halfway in the middle from the perspective of people like me. So we got $1 billion in road funding and $500 million in government reduction for the price of $500 million in tax increases. It's everybody can get along, and I think they finally did, and let's move forward.
So if nobody's happy, then we did something right.
We're going to get roads. Everybody should be happy about that.
Right, I'll give you that. Ken Braun on the line here from political columnist for MLive, talking primarily about the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, but of course the taxpayers will be footing the bill for the roads here, just in a different form and fashion. So, I mean, I agree with your point of view, but I wonder, because you just made the comment about some folks wanted to pay for roads all with new tax increases. Gee, I wonder what they are called. It seems to me there's a word for that. Oh, yeah, Democrat. The point being is, how do you find consensus to say, okay, we want this Taxpayers Bill of Rights. We only want to be able to raise tax on people if this happens, and you're not going to get agreement across the aisle. It's just never going to happen.
I think you could get it in. First of all, because of how rough Michigan's economy was, starting in 2001 and really going for the next decade, dozen years after that, we grew at less than the rate of inflation during that period. And if you had imposed a TABOR back then, we'd still be like $1 billion, I think is what I calculated, underneath that cap right now. They could have raised taxes $1 billion for the roads and still been underneath barely underneath the inflation cap. So I think if the timing is right, if you can say to Democrats, you know what, we're going to give you something you want in the short term, more spending on whatever it would be in the short term, but we want this hard cap in the long term, because what we don't want to happen, again, is what happened from 1997 to 2001, which is a period of very nice growth in Michigan, and it resulted in billions of dollars more than inflation coming into state government. Under a TABOR cap, state government would have had to ask the people to keep that money. Under the environment we had, it didn't, and it spent it on things and created a much bigger government that when we ended up with the rough times that started in 2001, we had a lot more mouths to feed in government, and we didn't have the revenue to do it, and the cuts were that much more painful. So let's stop that from happening again. Whenever it happens in the future, let's put the brakes on it right now. So what we'd be able to offer Democrats to get this thing, say, through the legislature and onto the ballot would be to say, we'll give you your spending now, but we're going to have spending cut some point in the future and forevermore when we have this hard cap put in.
So this is a crazy idea. I think what you're saying is plan for the future. What a weird idea, Ken. I mean, that's
it sounds,
a foreign concept, but plan for the. It's like, and God forbid I use the Boy Scouts as an example, but their motto, of course, is be prepared. Mm-hmm. And of course they're an organization being run down. But the point is, you need to be ready. You're exactly right. The question is, will we have the political will and the political spine to make it happen? Ken, great conversation, great column. You can find more from Ken on MLive.
Thank you, Steve.
.com. Ken, I greatly appreciate it, my friend.
Me too. Thank you much.
There you have it. Ken Braun, everybody, from MLive, freelance political writer. I like the idea of a Taxpayers Bill of Rights. You can't just charge me endlessly like some would like to do. Let's see here. Still to come today, we're going to have the conversation with Senator Rick Jones about growing dope in Michigan and roadside tests for those that have been smoking marijuana. He says science finally caught up. We'll talk about it later on the Steve Gruber Show.
Michigan, born and raised with Midwestern values and Michigan common sense.
In a white room with black curtains near the station. Black roof country, no gold pavement, tired starlings. Silver horses.
It is a Thursday here on the Steve Gruber Show. The hotline number, by the way, if you'd like to get involved with the program, is 888-900-9966, the Common Sense hotline. And we'll put you through if you got something commonsensical to say. We like to talk about it. I don't know if you saw this story here recently, but there were 3 kids arrested here recently, school kids, conspiring to shoot people at 2 different schools here in Michigan, in Linden. In Linden, believe it or not. These 3, it's about 20 miles south of Flint, so right there in WFNT land here on the MTN, listening to the Steve Gruber Show there. They were identified as Ryan Stevens, 18, Lamar Dukes, 15, and Cody Brewer, also 15. You know, what in the world happened to kids? You know, when I was in high school, which really wasn't that long ago, oftentimes we had guns with us in the trunk of the car, certainly this time of the year, during hunting season. During hunting season, I mean, you know, but you know, the difference was we didn't wander through the school, you know, shooting our classmates. You know, it's a bizarre mentality to me. Joining me, Chief Roberts from the Franklin Village Police Chief there. Chief, welcome back to the program.
Good to be with you, Steve.
I guess so. I mean, what has changed? I mean, just so people understand, mass shootings in America have remained relatively flat. I mean, there's not some massive spike in mass shootings, despite what some would try to tell you in a hysterical voice. But I guess the focus of these mass shootings and the fact that they happen at schools, it's unsettling. It makes everybody sick to their stomach. And why this mentality, I guess?
Well, I think part of the problem, or part of the major problem, is the media attention that all of these shootings get, and it puts things in the minds of some of these young students that maybe they can get away with it. I mean, with the social media these days, that has changed certainly from when you and I went to high school, and other factors out there. And frankly, that's how most of these cases get initiated by law enforcement, is that the students are on some form of social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and they're espousing some radical belief about something, or there's some hatred about someone, and that's normally how law enforcement gets involved in these cases to begin with.
Well, yeah, and they do get involved, you know, and I guess that's a good thing about social media, and it helps prevent this from happening.
Right.
But I guess it's my concern that these things happen at all. I mean, I don't know. You know, I've been raised around guns my entire life, right? I've been involved with guns my entire life, and I guarantee you, if I had played with a gun or had done something silly with a gun, my father would have broken my fingers, you know, and rightfully so. You know what I mean?
Right.
You know, you were taught respect of things. Is it just a general lack of respect for everything in this world?
Well, that could be. You know, it's a lot of social factors that are well above my pay grade in terms of why it happens. But I can tell you that from my time in the FBI, where I was before I retired and came here, is that we did some studies a few years ago when certain cities were seeing increases in violent crimes, and we hired a very exclusive think tank in Washington, D.C. to take a look at the social science of it and say, why are we seeing increased violent crimes in these particular areas? And much like cities today, like Chicago or Baltimore, are seeing. And what they found was the interesting statistical correlation. The number one correlation was the lack of two-parent households in those particular cities. So, you know, you talk about the fact that your father would have handled that situation with you very quickly. I think mine was the same way. I've always been around guns my whole life as well, and have been hunting my whole life as well. And you know, I think part of it is a parental control issue that has to be looked at and studied, and see if there's a way to get around that. And then, and of course, all of the media and the internet and the easy access that these kids have to the internet and the access that bad guys have on the internet to our kids that try to corrupt them or radicalize them in the case of terrorism.
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, let's be honest. The stimulus coming at everybody, including our children, from different sources, whether it's smartphones or computers or what. I mean, they're being bombarded with messages. Some good, many bad. You're right. You talk about recruitment of terrorists. You talk about recruitment into, well, like this deal in Linden. I don't know what the deal was here, but I'm sure they were talking back and forth using social media to some extent.
Right.
All right. So we're on the line with Dan Roberts here, the chief of the Franklin Village, also a former FBI man. I guess the good news here, Chief, is that at least the technology is allowing people in law enforcement like yourself and others to at least get ahead of the curve a lot.
That is true. In some cases, it does slow it down, the investigation down, because some of these social media require us to provide search warrants or whatever to get the information. But most of the time, we have a cooperating student or a cooperating teacher or administrator in the school that has access to the accounts and will show us what the threats are and what the beliefs are that are being said on these social media accounts. And that's really how we learn about them to begin with, is really from other students who see these messages out there and think, hey, there's something wrong here, and report it to us. Yeah. Which is a good thing.
I think it still comes back to one of the root causes here, and we could talk about this for the next 6 days, but the lack of attention to the mental health system in America is clearly a problem. And because young people have mental health challenges, the same as other people in the population, and we have very few resources to work with them, because I think that if we could deal with mental health issues, maybe we wouldn't have to deal with, a pair of 15-year-olds and an 18-year-old want to go kill people at their school. I'll give you 20 seconds for the last word, Chief.
Well, there's no doubt about that. The mental health system needs to be looked at, because what happens is law enforcement becomes the mental health providers by throwing these people in jail, which doesn't help them at all. But that's, other than it gets them off the street and maybe stopping them from doing other crimes, but that is not a good way to handle a mental health issue, by throwing somebody in prison with a bunch of other bad guys, and that's what we have today. That's how the mental health system works, unfortunately, today.
I greatly appreciate it, Chief. Chief Dan Roberts from the Franklin Village, also a former FBI guy. I'm just glad it didn't happen in Linden, my friend. I'm glad we didn't have to deal with that.
I agree with you there.
There you go. It's Thursday on the Steve Gruber Show.